Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Twitter Before and After Trump. We're going to get started, and I will now hand it over to Edison Research Senior VP, Tom Webster.
Thank you, Laura, and thanks to everyone who is joining us today for this webinar, which is not just going to be about Twitter and it's not just going to be about Trump. But we've been collecting a pretty unique data set for the past several months now, and we'll be doing so for throughout the next months and hopefully year to come. And that is a new tracking study of social media that we're premiering. And this is really the first data that we've pulled from it. And it is pulled from a moment in time that I think is super interesting in social media and super interesting to track in terms of human behavior. And there's certainly been a lot of kind of digital data out there about what has happened in terms of the spread of misinformation and things like that on social media. But this is really the first major study to come out that talks about how it affects people, how people really feel, how people perceive social media, and how they feel about the platforms that they use. So as we get started here, I want to point out that there is a hashtag for this. If you choose to tweet something about this on the Twitter, that's pretty meta. We're about to talk about Twitter. So if you'd like to tweet about Twitter, please use the social habit hashtag that you see there before you. And also, before I get started, I really want to thank the team that helped to put this together. The social habit data that underlies this. Thank you very much, Susie Ennis and Nicole Beniamini. Thank you to Larry Rosen for review and oversight. And a big thanks to Laura Ivy and to Megan Lazovic for a lot of heavy lifting in off hours to make this all come together, because it started in one place, it ended in another, and I think you're going to be just as fascinated as we are looking at this data. So first of all, just to level set things, we've been tracking social media now since 2008. We began tracking all social media platforms. Really, at the time in 2008, it was mostly Facebook with a skosh of Twitter, about 10% of the US population. This from our Infinite Dial research, which is a nationally projectable representative study of Americans 12 plus. Today, of course, 80% of Americans 12 plus use some form of social media. Facebook remains the number one platform, but the number of platforms out there are legion. We started a couple of months ago a brand new project that we call the Social Habit. We have put out a few reports under the name the Social Habit in the past, but this is something new for us, and this is a daily tracking study. We've had a lot of success with our tracking studies, including the Infinite Dial, but also Share of Year and the Podcast Consumer Tracker. And we've certainly put out a lot of great data, I think, that is a snapshot, a moment in time of how people are using social media. But now we have a new data set. It is available by subscription, where we're actually asking people every single day. So we can look at things weekly, we can look at things monthly, with a significant sample of US social media users to see how their attitudes are changing. They're morphing over time. Certainly the obvious benefits you get from trending and tracking, but it also affords us a chance to take a snapshot kind of before and after significant events. And that's certainly where we're going to start today. And I want to start today with a thought that was once shared by the late David Foster Wallace at a commencement speech he gave at Kenyon College. And he told a joke when he gave that speech about two young goldfish swimming, coming across an older goldfish. And as they pass each other in the water, the older goldfish asks the two younger goldfish, "How's the water?" And one of the younger goldfish asks back, "What is water?" And I think that's what happens to us on social media. For those of us who use it a lot, and I count myself as one of those, often we don't know what the water is because we're in the water so much. Certainly, one of the things that changed the water, put ripples in the water, put other artifacts into the water, was the rise of President Donald Trump on the platform. And regardless of your political persuasion, it's certainly been well documented that A, President Trump was a very active tweeter, and B, there were a lot of things that President Trump tweeted that incited people one way or the other. There have been, as I mentioned before, studies about the amount of information and misinformation that were either promoted or actively spread by this account. Those things have been quantified and measured. But what has not really been quantified and measured is how it made people feel. And certainly, I think Donald Trump has been the most significant tweeter, maybe even including Twitter's own president, Jack Dorsey, of all time in terms of the impact that he has had on the platform. That impact began with Twitter trying to restrain him and label some of his tweets as violating particular rules that were part of their terms of service. But ultimately, on January 9th, they banned his account. And they didn't just ban his account on January 9th. They also banned 70,000 other accounts from QAnon conspiracy theorists and other accounts that they had deemed to be spreading not just misinformation, but harmful information. So it's one thing to tweet that In-N-Out French fries are better than Five Guys French fries. That's misinformation. But harmful information, that is a higher bar. So with the benefit of our new data set, the Social Habits series, we have been able to essentially look at the water now that a lot of that has been removed. And the question is, was the water ever clear to begin with? And that's really what we're going to get to the bottom of in this webinar. What is the water that is around us when we are on social media? With the removal of President Trump's account and so many other accounts that were spreading, actively spreading verifiable misinformation, what's left? So in this study, Twitter before and after Trump, as I mentioned, we're going to talk not just about Twitter and not just about Trump, but really the immediate effect of a number of events on social media in and around January 9th. And with this report, we're really looking at a couple of weeks before January 9th, which is when Twitter enacted its ban on Twitter and the other 70,000 accounts, and after January 9th for a little over a week. So this sample of humans that we're looking at really in that immediate span of time, a couple of weeks before, a couple of weeks after Twitter's ban of Trump. Certainly the certification of the election occurred in this period of time. And as I mentioned, the removal of 70,000 other accounts. So just as a level set in our social habit data set, these are the services that people use at least once a day. And this is not an exhaustive list. The full data set has all of the leading platforms. But I want to show you Twitter here relative to just a couple of other platforms. And to show it basically before and after January 9th, which again, a lot of things happened in and around January 9th, including the certification of the election. So we're using that as sort of an arbitrary point. But before and after that date, now the percentage of social media users, which is our sample here, 18 plus, who used Facebook, about the same. Also about the same for those who used YouTube before and after the service. And if you don't believe YouTube is a social media service, spend some time in the comments and get back to me. Twitter, however, did not stay the same. Twitter did, in fact, go up 5 percentage points, nearly 20%, actually, or over 20%, I should say, from before January 9th to after January 9th. So there was certainly a significant increase in daily Twitter usage immediately in and around January 9th. Now, some of these levels may have returned. Some of these levels may have changed even more in that period since then. But we are looking at that bracketed window of a couple of weeks before and a couple of weeks after that period of time. And by the way, Parler, and my French teacher from high school, Madame Goff, would slay me if I don't say parler, but I guess it's Parler, also went up considerably after January 9th. And of course, not long after that, the service was closed. It is now back, apparently. Now, in terms of the percentage who used Twitter before and after January 9th, again, amongst all social media users 18 plus, 43% said that they used Twitter at all, not just daily, but really at all, before January 9th. And 52% said they did after January 9th. There was a significant movement here before and after that period of time in terms of people coming back to the service. And it is absolutely very likely to be people coming back to the service and not sudden new growth of brand new users. And if you break that down demographically, you can see the story here really is on the younger end, especially 18 to 34. Before January 9th, 60% of 18 to 34-year-olds said they ever used Twitter. 70% said that after January 9th. So there was certainly an influx of younger people returning to the service. That was true also 35 to 54, and somewhat more true with men than with women. And again, we're just talking here about Twitter. So in and around the date of January 9th, there certainly was something different in the water, and younger people came back to Twitter. But that's not really the full story here. It's a trailing variable. The real variable in play is your political outlook. Are you politically liberal? Are you politically conservative? This is part of the social habit data set that we track. And if you look at the people who use Twitter once per day, again, before and after January 9th, the largest growth that we see is amongst the politically liberal. The self described politically liberal went from 37% of politically liberal people using Twitter once a day to 46% after January 9th. There was, of course, a slight increase as well with political conservatives, but that increase was much more pronounced amongst liberals who, in and around the time of certification and the removal of Trump and other accounts, seemed to come back to the service. And just to look at that in total, that means that 41% of political liberal social media users in this country use Twitter at least once a day. 19% of politically conservative social media users do once a day. And this is in that entire period that we are looking at, the 2 weeks before and the 2 weeks after. Twitter is about twice as liberal, right? And that, by the way, has always been the case. That has been the case since we started tracking Twitter all the way back in 2008 and 2009. And so when we talk about the water, this is the water that is left. Twitter is a liberal service in terms of the preponderance of its users. Twice as many politically liberal people use Twitter daily compared to politically conservative, or at least that's the composition. So even with the removal of some accounts that potentially politically liberal people might find objectionable, it's not necessarily leaving a completely unbiased situation in terms of user accounts. There is a liberal bias to Twitter. And if you compare that 41% liberal and 19% conservative on Twitter to what the nation looks like, you'll see it's fairly different. In America overall, amongst all social media users, 26% are liberal and 31% are conservative. And indeed, America leans slightly right center in total when you add all of this up. But that is not the case with Twitter. Twitter absolutely does lean more left. And of course, if you look at all of that, you think about all of the social media platforms that we use, many of the social media platforms in play every day have more active users that identify themselves as politically liberal than do politically conservative. So even the kind of default setting for those social media platforms can be somewhat more favorable for people who are accustomed to swimming in liberal waters. There are exceptions. I think Parler has been a notable one. But even without the presence of President Trump and some of the other accounts that were removed, that doesn't mean that the waters are completely 50-50, right? So that's important to keep in mind when you consider that ultimately Twitter is the sum product of the output of its users, the user-generated content. And amongst the most active Twitter users, they're more likely to be politically liberal. I'll bring this back for those who use the service at least once a day. Again, just to give you a sense of the relative size of these networks, especially comparing Twitter, which is in the high 20s in terms of the percentage who use it at least once a day, with Facebook, which is more than twice that, and YouTube, which is about twice that. So in size, in terms of daily users, Twitter is quite a bit smaller than Facebook and YouTube. But when you ask people which one social media service is too political, well, a couple things happen here. First of all, in general, Twitter punches way above its weight, and maybe not in a good way if you're someone who prefers their social media platforms to not be too political, though Twitter is really kind of a distant third in the list that I showed. And obviously this list does not, the former list did not include things like Instagram and TikTok, really just to show you the top 2 or 3 platforms. But in this graph, you can see that the percentage of people who think Twitter is too political is quite high compared to its relative size in the ecosystem. And that remained unchanged really before and after January 9th. What did not remain unchanged was the percentage of people who said Facebook was too political. That went down, and that went down a lot. And you might ask yourself, how does the removal of President Trump from Twitter impact that? And while I'm not necessarily saying that there's a causal relationship, there is certainly an information gap that has been created here. And a lot of what we see on Twitter is what our friends are sharing with us. And it seems like after January 9th, and again, the certification of the election comes into play here as well, our friends were a little less political, perhaps, and Facebook cooled off somewhat from a lot of the political dialect and diatribe that was happening. And of course, the other thing you'll note here is that Parler was absolutely perceived after January 9th as being too political. That went from 3%, and really a lot of that stemmed from people just not hearing of the service, to after January 9th, 12% of social media users felt that Parler was too political. And you have to think that a lot of that was just flat out awareness and Parler being mentioned a lot in the news as a platform that was attracting conservative voices. When you look at how liberals and conservatives feel about this question, you see a couple of things. First of all, if you are politically liberal, you still feel that Facebook and Twitter are quite political. Those numbers are high. They're not as high as the politically conservative numbers, but they are very high. 29% of politically liberal social media users say that Facebook is one that's too political. 27% say Twitter. There's obviously a big disparity again here with Parler. I suspect many of the politically liberal people who mentioned Parler in this question have not actually been on Parler, but certainly many people have been on Facebook and Twitter, and they're getting the lion's share of credit in this question about being too political. Some of what has happened with social media, and certainly what led and has led to a lot of the bans that we have seen in various platforms, is the spread of misinformation, disinformation. And when you ask people which social media service do you turn to first for news and information, it's a bit of a mixed bag. You see Facebook up there, you see YouTube up there, and you see Twitter up there. And that has gone up a bit since January 9th. And I think whether or not we explicitly say it was caused by things like the certification of the election and the removal of a number of accounts, Twitter is certainly perceived a little bit more strongly as a source of news and information after January 9th than it was before January 9th. And then we also ask, which social media service do you trust the most? And here's where you see Twitter really take a tumble. Now, I've already shown you some relative data on the popularity of Twitter and how political people think Twitter is. On this list, it's fairly well down there, right? 5% before January 9th, 7% after January 9th say that Twitter is the social media service that they trust the most. YouTube actually engenders the most trust on this list, followed by Facebook. So Twitter is certainly used by a significant portion of the social media universe, but there are some trust issues. And we will be able to say over time, as we continue to track with our social habit data, whether that erosion continues or whether that erosion arrests itself and whether or not it turns around. But right now, it's not very high on the trust meter. And that is especially true with politically liberal people. And some of that may be as a result of their perceptions, perhaps, of how long some erroneous information was allowed to exist on the platform. And really, you don't see it as strongly with political conservatives. But again, political conservatives are less likely to use the service on a regular basis. So that certainly plays into it. In terms of Twitter itself, when we ask both political liberals and political conservatives how much they distrust or trust the news and information they see on Twitter, it's a pretty mixed bag here with both liberals and conservatives. You look at the bottom bar here with conservatives, over half answered a 1 to this question, do not trust at all. So over half of political conservatives, social media users, do not trust Twitter at all. Now, it fares slightly better with political liberals, but not overwhelmingly so. If you add up the 4s and the 5s here, the people who say they trust the news and info they hear on Twitter a lot, with those who say they trust it a little, you get a little under a third, which means about 2/3 say that that's not the case, that they actively trust the news and information they see and hear on Twitter. So while conservatives have a stronger distrust of the service, you would not call this a win, really, with folks leaning in either direction in terms of the amount of trust that they have for the platform. Now, I showed you all of this except the very bottom pair here, which is none of these. And really, that's the winner here. And what we have learned over the past months and several years of the politicizing of the various social media platforms is that many people just simply have a distrust of all of these platforms, 40% before and 40% after the events in early January say that none of these are really services that they trust the most. And as a part of that, it's the awareness that there is a lot of disinformation shared on social media. And this is one of many things that liberals and conservatives agree upon. We spend a lot of time focusing on social media about trolls and about people who are inciting people, if not to violence, then at least to inflamed feelings, let's say. But this is something that actually liberals and conservatives agree upon. If you add up the fours and the fives here, they're about the same. Well over half of liberals and conservatives agree there is too much disinformation being shared on social media. So this is not just a Twitter issue, right? This is an issue with all of the information that we share on social media. And in fact, over half of both liberals and conservatives say that social media promotes conspiracy theories. The disagreement with that statement is very, very small. Now, there are, of course, positives about social media, and we've reported on those in past studies. But in this particular slice of this, in Twitter before and after Trump, the social habit data that we looked at really looks at some of the complaints that people have about social media, including things like conspiracy theories and distrust. And again, that's shared by both liberals and conservatives, the majority of whom are unhappy about that aspect of social media. And many of you may have seen this chart before. It's a chart that's regularly updated by an organization called Ad Fontes Media. And it's a wonderful chart that lists the media bias of all of the various outlets that we have available to us on two different axes. One, the quantity of facts versus kind of editorial that's used in the bulk of the reporting. And two, the bias, either left or middle or right, and the gradations of that, of those particular media outlets. So those media outlets that are kind of in the top center here are generally perceived as being close to the center and as mostly fact-based, where when you get off to the left and right edges and down towards the bottom of the graph, that's when you start to get a lot of partisan theories, partisan non-fact-based reporting and things like that. We don't have something like this for social media, and I don't know that we're about to debut one. There certainly are not as many social platforms available to us as there are news outlets, as you see here. But I suspect that if you were to look at the political leanings of the various social platforms that are out there, you'd kind of get something here, a little bit left of center and way down in the not fact-based area, right? You might get Parler a little bit over to the right. You might get Twitter certainly over to the left. But the data that I've just shown you is that the majority of both liberals and conservatives agree that there's a lot of disinformation being spread and conspiracy theories being spread on social media. And that is how many people are feeding themselves day to day. As a result of all that, here's something else that both liberals and conservatives agree about. Regardless of who they follow on social media and what their political leanings are, well over half of both liberals and conservatives agree that social media companies have too much power. They have a lot of power in our lives, especially, and I'm raising my hand here and admitting it, let me actually do that, that I spend a lot of time on social media. Social media does, in fact, have an impact on the information that I consume and even on how I think about things. And what this data is telling us, that almost nobody disagrees with this statement, and there is widespread agreement with the majority of both liberals and conservatives that social media companies have too much power. And increasingly, people are worrying about that power, especially with politically conservative people here, for a variety of reasons, I think. When using social media, how much do you worry about how powerful social media companies are? It's one thing to say, I think they are powerful, I think they are not powerful. It's another thing to say that you're worried about that. And again, if you add up the fours and fives here, majority of both liberals and conservatives express concern about this. But look at the fives here for those who are politically conservative. And again, I think in terms of social media outlets that cater towards that audience more, they don't have that many outlets compared to the number of outlets that they have for news and journalism and things like that. So it is a viable concern. It's a viable concern for both sides of the political spectrum. And here's another thing, again, that especially if you add up the fours and fives here, it's almost identical, that both liberals and conservatives agree upon. Social media companies should be held accountable for the type of content they promote. And held accountable by whom? That's an interesting question. Whether that is a third party or whether that is the government, that's not something that we really got into in this particular question. And that certainly may have influenced the results. It may have influenced how partisan people fell on different aspects of the results of this. In any case, when asked if social media companies should be held accountable, again, this is something we can agree on. There's an overwhelming majority of both liberals and conservatives agree that this is the case. And to me, this is one that's really troubling in a lot of ways. Do you worry that social media is bad for society? Just about half of those who are politically liberal agree that that is the case. And they're certainly amongst the most active users of platforms like Twitter. And well over half of political conservatives believe that that is the case. So anywhere from half to well over half, depending on your political ideology, worry that social media is bad for society. Now, again, as we've reported in the past, there are many wonderful benefits to social media to stay in touch with people and to really strengthen in many ways those kinds of weak ties that any one of which may not be all that important to us, but they're all part of the net that holds us up socially, right? And social media provides us with that multitude of weak ties and also some of those stronger threads that keep us supported, especially in a time like this where so many of us are disconnected from many of the societal things that prop us up. But be that as it may, in the current climate, both liberals and conservatives have some concern here that not everything about social media is good. And when we ask people, do the positives of social media outweigh the negatives? This is a bit of a mixed bag. I think the fairest thing you can say from liberals is that it is a complete mixed bag. There are positives and there are negatives. And amongst conservatives in this country, there seem to be more negatives. And some of those negatives have to do with the spread of news and information, but also some of those negatives have to do with how we treat each other on social media. And you can really see here before and after the ban that a lot of these attitudes held before and after the ban. So they're not specifically necessarily related to the certification of the election or the removal of President Trump's account or the removal of those other 70,000 accounts. There's really something else at play here. And that's what I really want to end with before I get to some summary points from what we've learned. We ask people, which social media service makes you feel bad emotionally? I'm sad that any of these are above zero, right? So really the point of this graph is sort of less the fact that Facebook is number one and Twitter is number two and so on. It's that there's this percentage of people on both sides of the aisle, just amongst total social media users in general, that say that there's a service that makes them feel bad emotionally. And that makes me feel bad emotionally. And if you look at that by both liberals and conservatives, you'll see that that's actually a bit stronger amongst liberals. And again, I think you see that 7% for Parler, which I would suspect many politically liberals have not tried, but just the existence of it and what they've heard about it has made them feel bad emotionally. But amongst conservatives, you see things like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. And there's a wide variety of reasons why a social media service might make you feel bad emotionally. And those aren't all political, right? And we captured some of the reasons here why people say that why perhaps social media platforms have from time to time made them feel bad. And the vast majority of social media users would say yes to one or more of these things. About 3/4 of politically liberal social media users and 2/3 of politically conservative social media users say they've seen a news story that they think had misleading or invented information. But, go down the list here. Been offended by videos, images, or stories. That's roughly half. Felt judged or criticized for your personal opinions. That's something liberals and conservatives have in common in nearly equal numbers. Been called an offensive name. Felt discriminated or harassed because of your race. And all of these numbers are above zero, right? And many of them are actually quite high, such as judged and criticized for your personal opinions, been called an offensive name. And even on this page, all of these numbers are significant. Been embarrassed on purpose, been threatened, harassed, or stalked, felt discriminated or harassed because of your gender, had your private information released, or been involved in a scam or fraudulent activity, which again sort of cuts across both sides of the political spectrum. So many of us, the vast majority of us, have felt some pain, have felt some hurt from social media. And so it's not necessarily all about politics, but it is about civility, and it is about how we treat each other in social media. And again, it comes back to that question that we showed earlier. Do you think social media companies should be held accountable for these things? And amongst all of their differences, both liberals and conservatives, majority of both, agree that they should. And really that brings us to this statement here. With which statement do you agree more? Social media helps people or social media hurts people? 43% of politically liberal social media users believe social media hurts people. 60% of politically conservative social media users believe that social media hurts people. And again, they may have fewer outlets where they feel comfortable given the kind of broad spectrum of the platforms that are out there. So I have one more point I want to wrap up on, but I want to just summarize some of the main points of this and talk a little bit more about the future of the social habit. First of all, again, this study was the immediate snapshot of a couple of weeks before and a couple of weeks after the removal of President Trump's account and another 70,000 accounts that were spreading potentially harmful information. And millions of users returned to Twitter during that period of time. We will continue to monitor what happens over the coming months with that, but certainly in that immediate span of time, a lot of people came back to Twitter. It's also true that with the exception of Parler, active social media users are more likely to identify as politically liberal than conservative. And that's especially true on Twitter. So even with the removal of all of those accounts, that doesn't mean that the service is sort of returned to a 50-50 balance. It is actually not remotely close to the balance that we see in the US population. That's something to keep in mind when you read your tweets. The certification of the election, Trump's removal, and the removal of all of those other misleading accounts may have also had a cooling impact on Facebook. And even though we saw Twitter regain users, we also saw in that brief snapshot that we took, Facebook was seen by far fewer users as too political. I think that was a potentially spun off from there being less information to have been shared from Twitter onto Facebook. But also, I think our friends in general took a pause. I know mine did, and I appreciated that. Twitter significantly over-indexes for being too political and is not seen as trustworthy by political conservatives. But liberals are also skeptical of Twitter's trustworthiness, and there's a heightened awareness on both sides of the spread of misinformation on the platform. The majority of liberals and conservatives both agree social media spreads disinformation and conspiracy theories. While conservatives have access to a variety of news outlets that are tailored to different viewpoints, there aren't so many platforms similar to Parler, for instance, that are really geared towards a conservative audience. And the conservative audience has a wide spectrum in terms of how far along the right they are and how close to the center they are. And so essentially, it doesn't look like the news population, the population of news and journalism outlets. So something else to keep in mind as you look at how social media platforms are being used. But the bottom line, conservatives and liberals, both equally likely to report that they've been judged or criticized for their personal beliefs. And one of the things that really struck us in looking at all these data is how much liberals and conservatives really agreed. And some of the negative things that we asked about social media may have seen slightly stronger agreement with conservatives. But for most of the negative responses that we got, the majority of both liberals and conservatives held some fairly strong opinions about the power that social media platforms have, whether or not they should be accountable for those actions, and whether or not social media is good for society. And in fact, the vast majority of social media users report that they've had some harm done to them on social media. Could be minor, could be major, could simply be the spread of misinformation, which could have major impacts. It could be active harassment, personal criticism. And again, there are many positive reasons why we continue to use social media, and there are many positive benefits of social media. But even with all of those, 43% of political liberals and 60% of political conservative social media users agree social media is a harm and not a help to society. And I want to end here by bringing you back sort of another view of this graph. I showed you this graph by liberals and conservatives. Now I'll show it to you with the total population of social media users, both before and after January 9th. And really, even when you have the election certified, even when you remove President Trump's Twitter account, even when you remove accounts from other social media platforms of entities that were spreading harmful misinformation, both before and after that sort of early January point, it's a mixed bag. About half say social media helps people, and about half say social media hurts people. And I'll close here. I started with water, and I'll end with water. You might be tempted to look at a graph like this, a pure 50-50 coin toss between helps and hurts, and say that it's a glass half full it's a glass half empty. But this entire sample uses social media. This entire sample expresses an opinion on it. So it's not a case of the glass being half full or half empty. It's the glass being half clean and half dirty. And there's no such thing as half dirty water. So we have a lot to talk about with social media. There are a lot of societal issues to talk about with social media and the power of these platforms and whether or not we as a public or the government or some other body needs to step in. And I don't know the answers to that, but we do have the answers that people are telling us. And at this moment in time, there are some issues with social media, and those issues may not be solvable solely by the users. As I mentioned, all of these data came from a report that we call the Social Habit. It is a daily online tracking study of US social media consumers 18 plus. It's a lot of questions about how we use social media, how we think about social media. We've seen a small snapshot today about political perspectives on social media, and we have a lot more on trust, a lot more on privacy. This is a subscription product. There are subscriptions available for 1 month and also up to a year where you're allowed to add some custom questions. I'm happy to send more information to you if you're interested. I've put my email address here. You just send it to me and I can send you a one sheet on the service, and happy to answer any other questions about it. And with that, I will pause here, stop sharing my screen, and I'll just double check to see if there are any questions. Nope, do not see any questions. So it's been about 40 minutes. Thank you for the gift of your time and attention. Thank you from all of us at Edison. Thanks to the team that I mentioned at the beginning here, who really helped put all this together. It's fascinating data. We'll be publishing all of this very, very soon. The deck will be available very, very soon. Until then, I'm Edison's SVP, Tom Webster, and I thank you.